The ornate mirror in Lady Shu's chambers reflected not the privileged beauty she had once been, but the hollow-eyed survivor of a systematic campaign of psychological destruction that had transformed her from a hopeful 17-year-old girl into a willing executioner of her own kind within the space of 18 months. What she discovered behind the gilded walls of the Forbidden City wasn't the glorious life of imperial favor promised by centuries of romantic mythology, but participation in history's most sophisticated program of human conditioning, where young women were systematically converted into instruments of state terror through methods that combined ancient Chinese philosophy with cutting-edge understanding of human psychology to create self-perpetuating systems of oppression that would influence authoritarian control techniques for centuries to come. The winter of 1644 marked the beginning of the Qing dynasty's reign, when Manchu conquerors established control over the world's largest population through innovative methods that extended far beyond traditional military occupation into comprehensive systems of cultural and psychological domination. The imperial harem wasn't simply a collection of the emperor's women, but functioned as the central laboratory where techniques of systematic dehumanization were developed, tested and refined before being exported throughout the conquered Chinese territories and later applied to Tibetan, Mongolian and Central Asian populations during subsequent phases of imperial expansion. Each concubine represented not just an individual tragedy, but a calculated experiment in breaking human resistance while maintaining the appearance of cultural tradition and even honor for the victims and their families. If you believe you understand the true nature of historical oppression, prepare to confront evidence that will fundamentally challenge your assumptions about how civilizations maintain control through the systematic exploitation of their most vulnerable members. Because what we're about to explore represents one of history's most successfully concealed examples of state-sponsored terrorism disguised as cultural sophistication and romantic tradition. The selection process that brought young women into the imperial harem began with comprehensive intelligence, gathering operations that extended into every corner of the empire, where specially trained agents identified potential candidates based not on beauty alone, but on detailed psychological profiles that assessed their families' political reliability, their communities' potential for resistance, and their individual capacity for surviving the systematic conditioning programs that would transform them into willing participants in their own and others' systematic destruction. These preliminary operations took years to complete and involved elaborate deception campaigns that convinced entire regions they were participating in honor-bringing traditions while actually delivering their most promising daughters into sophisticated human trafficking networks designed to serve multiple imperial purposes. Simultaneously, the famous beauty contests that supposedly determined harem membership were actually complex psychological evaluation procedures designed to identify which combinations of intelligence, desperation, emotional instability, and moral flexibility would prove most useful for different aspects of imperial control operations throughout the expanding empire. Officials conducting these evaluations weren't seeking romantic companions for the emperor, but psychological weapons that could be deployed against conquered populations through carefully orchestrated programs of cultural infiltration, intelligence gathering, and systematic elimination of local leadership structures that might threaten long-term imperial stability in newly conquered territories. Lady Shu's transformation from hopeful candidate to efficient killer began the moment she crossed the threshold into the Forbidden City, where palace officials immediately began systematic procedures designed to break down her individual identity while conditioning her to derive psychological satisfaction from inflicting suffering on fellow prisoners who had been deliberately positioned as competitors for imperial favor. The initial conditioning process involved months of carefully orchestrated humiliation designed to create learned helplessness, followed by intermittent reward schedules that created psychological dependency on imperial approval, and culminating in systematic exposure to escalating levels of violence that gradually normalized behaviors that would have been impossible for mentally healthy individuals to contemplate, much less execute, with the precision and emotional detachment required. For advancement within the palace hierarchy, the daily routine within the concubine quarters combined elements of military training with systematic psychological manipulation to create human beings capable of extraordinary cruelty, while maintaining the appearance of refined cultural sophistication that impressed foreign diplomats and convinced domestic populations. That imperial rule represented the pinnacle of civilized achievement, rather than systematic exploitation disguised as cultural tradition. Morning sessions involved competitive exercises where survival depended on demonstrating superior ability to manipulate, betray, and ultimately eliminate other women through methods that ranged from subtle psychological torture to elaborate execution. Ceremonies disguised as religious observances and cultural celebrations. The architectural design of the harem quarters revealed the true sophistication of the imperial control system, where every element served multiple functions related to surveillance, psychological manipulation, and systematic conditioning of inhabitants to accept and eventually participate in their own systematic destruction. The famous beauty of imperial gardens concealed comprehensive observation networks where trained analysts monitored every interaction between prisoners, while elaborate decoration included hidden mechanisms for controlling environmental conditions. To maximize psychological pressure and create optimal circumstances for breaking individual resistance to imperial authority through systematic manipulation of basic human needs, including food, water, temperature, lighting, and social contact. Emperor Kangxi personally supervised the development of conditioning protocols that combined systematic physical abuse with sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques drawn from ancient Chinese military strategy, Confucian philosophy, and Buddhist concepts of suffering and enlightenment to create comprehensive systems of human control that could be applied to managing conquered populations throughout the expanding empire. These methods involved carefully designed cycles of punishment and reward that created psychological dependency on imperial approval, systematic isolation from emotional support systems that might maintain individual identity or resistance to authority, and gradual exposure to increasingly extreme forms of violence that desensitized participants to human suffering, while conditioning them to associate survival with successful participation in systematic oppression of others. The medical experiments conducted within the harem extended far beyond simple torture into systematic scientific research designed to understand the limits of human psychological and physical endurance while developing practical techniques that could be applied to controlling larger populations during periods of conquest, colonization, or social unrest throughout the empire. Palace physicians tested various combinations of drugs, surgical procedures, environmental manipulations, and psychological conditioning techniques on concubines, documenting their observations in detailed scientific treatises that were later distributed to military commanders and provincial administrators dealing with rebellious populations or newly conquered territories, requiring pacification through methods more sophisticated than simple military occupation. The breeding programs within the palace served purposes that extended far beyond producing imperial heirs into systematic genetic experiments designed to create specialized populations with specific physical and psychological characteristics suited for different roles within the expanding imperial machine of conquest and control. Children born to concubines were immediately removed from their mothers and subjected to comprehensive evaluation procedures that determined their future functions based on detailed criteria, including physical attributes, psychological profiles, intellectual capacity, ethnic background, and genetic markers that indicated potential usefulness for specific types of imperial service, including intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, cultural infiltration, and systematic elimination of resistance movements in conquered territories. The seasonal eliminations that occurred within the harem weren't random violence, but carefully planned military operations designed to maintain optimal psychological pressure among survivors, while providing practical training for officials who would later implement similar programs throughout the expanding empire, as imperial forces encountered new populations requiring systematic pacification through terror rather than conventional military methods. These mass executions were disguised as religious ceremonies, natural disasters, or disease outbreaks. But palace records reveal meticulous planning that included detailed psychological analysis of victims, sophisticated timing designed to maximize terror among witnesses, and careful documentation of which elimination methods proved most effective at breaking remaining prisoners' resistance.